Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming. This next session, I promise you, will be one of the most interesting I think you'll have heard in a very long time. If you follow the media at all, you know that all over the world, in television and movies, one of our great obsessions, of course, is dramas of law and politics. There are almost innumerable television shows, it seems, in America on that subject, and now through Netflix, we're seeing them around the world, although they're shown around the world. Remarkably, in all this time, in this consideration, we never really get underneath the superficial drama of the contests for goods and winning and losing in the struggle for policies and decisions and so on. We never actually look at the principles underlying law and politics. And yet, anciently, and in everybody's education, if you're going to go into those fields, your fundamental philosophy and worldview is critical to whatever you're going to engage in, whatever skills that you're going to bring. And in fact, every great civilization, actually almost every civilization altogether, shamanic, with its shamanic roots in a higher process, has engaged in discussing the deeper principles or the higher principles of law and politics. So we're going to actually reframe this new paradigm in politics by saying the new paradigm in politics is what we'll call parapolitics. I'm borrowing that term from a political scientist named Raghavan Iyer, the father of the famed travel writer and cultural writer named Pico Iyer, who described it as, in contrast to the contest for the struggle over the goods and decisions of ordinary and daily life, the imaginative application of seminal ideas, vitalizing political theory and practice, the elaboration of fundamental principles into paradigms of relationships among persons and between civil means and human ends, the quest for political understanding and action based upon expanding self-awareness, and the ever-receding perspective of ideas rooted in the ethics, metaphysics, and psychology of self-transcendence. We have three speakers today who are going to take us from what you might call the horizontal view of politics in the ordinary sense to this more vertical view of politics aligned with higher human ethics, inspiration, and notions and actual practices of transcendence. And the first of them I want to introduce to you right now is Arthur Versluis. I've told Arthur in private correspondence that I consider him not only a compliment to our previous speaker, Jeffrey Kripal, but both of them as two of the men I'd most like to see emerge as public intellectuals in our time. He's made a unique contribution in the academy and beyond to restoring to our own appreciation the great currents that underpin our own civilization. In his many books on Western esotericism, on the Neoplatonist tradition that runs throughout the entirety of Western culture, the appearance of this transcendentalism in American culture, as well as Eastern religions and Native American culture, has created a body of work that is extremely lucid and accessible to ordinary people, but actually very much purposed towards the same purpose that great writers like Plato, Confucius, and others, writers, thinkers, had in their day, about infusing our politics with, in Arthur's own title of his book, a mystical gnosis. Subtitled Politics, Gnosis, and Emerging Cultures. It's actually an extraordinary new book that looks for practical ways and also historical examples in which this higher intuitive understanding of East and West, and as Ervin will bring, of modern science, can actually infuse our culture. He's a professor of religion, and also been in the departments of literature at Michigan State University, where Fred studied when he was in America. And he's been around a long time, and he's also taken a very active role in writing about radical movements and about politics in our time. So, Arthur, I'm delighted you've joined us. Thank you so much for coming today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed with this event and the way you've all set it up. It's quite remarkable.
So, tell us, what are we going to do to create the mystical state?
Well, the mystical state, of course, the title is a pun, and it has a double meaning, because at the center of the mystical state, that is Paulus, is the transformation of individual and community through spiritual practice. And so that's something that in the West has not exactly been in the foreground all the way through Western European history, but there has been a continuous current of mysticism. And so some of my work focuses on inner practice and different transformative practices. But another current of my work is critical of the what you could call Leviathan state. And so there's a political dimension to my work as well. And those two things interconnect.
You've identified a strong strand in Western culture, as well as in the academy, of a kind of an aggressive exotericism that does not actually understand and appreciate what has been communicated to us by the very figures whose names we chisel into the top of our colleges and universities, those buildings, but somehow goes on to ignore what they said and presented to us. What is going on in this struggle right now that you see, especially in the West, as you see so many people struggling to reacquire our spiritual inheritance, but seemingly up against a strong resistance from it, not only within the established religions, but even within the academy itself?
Well, there is a long history of suppression of esoteric currents in the West, and that goes back to the early Christian period. And so, for many people, the very idea that there's a continuous tradition of movement toward transcendence in the West is unfamiliar, and that ties with something else, which is a political current in the West that's also somewhat unfamiliar now for many people, and that's the current of decentralization or federalism. And those two things are actually, in my view, connected. But we can talk about that if you like.
I would. Please go on.
Yeah, the decentralization. What I'm referring to here is the tension between, on the one side, the what I would call following Hobbes, the Leviathan state, the tendency toward more and more centralization, centralized power as the solution to everything. And that tendency is tied to what I'm calling also, you had mentioned exoterism, or I sometimes refer to it as externalism, meaning a way of seeing the world that's fundamentally materialistic, and that those two things tie together. In other words, a Leviathan state tends to be very materialistic. It's focused on changes only in the physical world, and it often, historically and up to the present time, is actually directly, as in the case of China, directly opposed to and persecuting of different spiritual groups and movements. And so that also sometimes can be the case in other historical examples that I could point to. But primarily what I would say is, on the one side, you have individual freedom and decentralization. On the other, you have centralization. And those two things are ultimately fundamentally opposed. And I realize that many people are looking to a centralized solution for many things today, including some of the speakers undoubtedly in this group and participants. But my argument in the mystical state is that ultimately a healthy state, a healthy polis, has to be has to reflect a cultural connection to the place where it is, to the land around it. And that is fundamentally a local phenomenon, not a grand imposed phenomenon from outside. So that in a nutshell is what I would say.
So you have written about this matter of gnosis, or higher spiritual intuition. And you write in your book, Mystical State, the purpose of a living culture is to encourage noesis in those who are so inclined. Noesis is a conduit through which new cultures are born. It is the conduit to what transcends the sensible world and ultimately to what transcends all form, shape, or differentiation. Now, you know, as a scholar, that people like Plato in writing the Republic had no great confidence that the general public was going to be joining in to that enterprise. In fact, Socrates stated over and over again, and Plato reflected in his writings, that the majority of people are not interested in the demands of higher human growth, spiritual awakening, and so on. And so Plato's own recommendation was that there be a renunciate group of young boys and girls set aside from birth who would be the leaders and rulers of a state, and that the forms of democracy, oligarchy, monarchy, and so on would always be problematic unless you had this higher vision. In Eastern cultures, in Asian cultures, you have often had this meeting of political leaders, heads, kings of states, and great spiritual adepts. And in most of the encounters you would see, at least anciently described, the kings would offer great deference to the spiritual knowers because they would want to be guided by them. Yet in our own, and certainly in Western history, we have great examples of political leaders seizing the crown, you could say, from the hands of the Pope or the priest and saying, I will anoint myself as the leader of this time. I don't really need your vision. So now that the people in a democratic society have the decision-making power, how do we move to inspire the people as a whole to want to engage that higher process of human growth so that they're qualified to lead and to infuse politics with this parapolitical vision of this higher gnosis, as you describe, or transcendence? What's the route to get there?
Well, I think there are two different ways to think about that. My own background is not only in mysticism and Western traditions, but also in Tibetan Buddhism, and so I have a fair bit of experience over the years with Tibetan Buddhist practice, and those things, in my view, and maybe our subsequent speakers or participants in this group will have something to say about this, Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in the Nyingma tradition, which is what I'm most familiar with, although I have connections to all of them, is focused on a transformative path. So there's a teacher and a student, and there's a continuous map. There's a map to you could say transcendence. And that has never existed in exactly the same way in the West. In other words, you don't have, and I talk about this as in one book as ahistorical continuity, meaning that you do have esoteric figures and you do have spiritual figures in the West, but you don't have a consistent esoteric training system or means of conveying practice advice in the same way. It doesn't exist. And so that's the critical thing, in my view. In terms of emerging culture, you need a means for also cultural continuity and for self-transformation and transformation, continuous transformation in a positive way of the community. How do you get that? It's ultimately not through leaders. It's not through politics the way we think about it. It's through practice. So you need that kind of community, whether you call it monastic or whether it's lay yogis or however you want to think of it. Because again, in my view, decentralization is critical. In other words, having a local a community center where some people are devoted to spiritual practice is very different than an imposed system from the outside. So my whole view is actually, my whole perspective in mystical state, in Platonic mysticism, and in various other books is actually very different than the way most people think about either politics or religion. And I'm aware of that, but that's kind of my calling, to bring some of these things to light.
I would note that you come from a longstanding agricultural family in Michigan and have a very strong connection to a visceral connection to the earth, as well as to the indigenous traditions earth related around the world, which you've written about. And by the way, I should point out before I let you go on that your most recent book, Conversations in Apocalyptic Times, A Guide for the Spiritual Seeker, has recently been published. And what you've just said, Arthur, I think is just the best introduction to our next speaker here, Fred Tsao. Fred is Frederick, or Fred as he's known to his friends, is a fourth generation business owner who was born in the East and educated in the West, actually at Michigan State. And he is chairman of his family business, IMCPAA. And in 1995, he transformed the business from a traditional shipping company to a diverse multinational conglomerate. I think the company's over 100 years old, by the way. Like you, he's someone who's not afraid to push boundaries in business or in life. In his case, he founded Family Business Network Asia and served on the board of Family Business Network International, where he inspired the exploration of family businesses' role within the global system. He started his research in 1995 into sustainability and modernity, and eventually into Eastern wisdom in particular, Chinese esoteric traditions, Western science, and the paradigms of conscientiousness and evolution. So he brings insights from both his very much practical experience and his cultural inheritance and knowledge of the Eastern paradigms of the Tao, the Confucius and Buddhist practices, and a real experience on applying them in the future. And if we were looking about cultural inheritance, I think that we should be spending a lot of time looking at the millennia-long history of the great Chinese cultures, Taoism, Confucianism, which have just a spectacular array of developments, of historical developments, intertwining threads relative to law, science, medicine, and all the rest that have created a loom, a rich soil of cultural continuity for this, in fact, this kind of mystical state that you mentioned, this higher infused culture. So Fred Tsao, thank you so much. I see the sun on the horizon over your shoulder. I think that's a good image for which us all to greet you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, unlike the other two speakers, are certificates and books. The background, I have the sunset.
and a new book just coming out, co-written with your fellow speaker here, Ervin. So tell us, what is it? What are we missing? What's the inheritance? Because all traditions now, as my own spiritual teacher Adidal once said, we may live in a place and we're responsible to that place, but the cultural inheritances of the world belong to us all in common. So in some sense, we're all Confucians and Jews and all the rest of it today. What about the inheritance of our Asian sisters and brothers, not only in China, but beyond? What is useful for that new paradigm and all that?
Well, the new paradigm, first of all, crosses between physics and metaphysics, and thus demystified all the stories behind it into something that is more understandable in the scientific context. And of course, the science is now moving into just one science because of all the cross-disciplinary integration in this integrated period. Eventually we landed into the quantum paradigm and the science of consciousness in life, which is already happening. And in China, it always focused on this, because unlike many people criticize hey, the Chinese does not have philosophy. And indeed, the Chinese do not have philosophy. Chinese, long ago, before this concept, even philosophy don't exist, because they accepted the Tao, they understand the yin and yang and the hexagon, and that was before writing was created. And it is always a systemic understanding of interpretation of alignment to Tao, and the ultimate aspiration or the ultimate goal of all Chinese, unlike the Indian, is called mukti, freedom, right? The Chinese called unification, to be one with heaven or with God or whatever you call it. And that actually, the heaven is inside us. So the oneness is the foundation through the Tao, which is the evolutionary energy that created this material form. And long they know, especially in Buddhism, this is an illusion of form. This is just a form. And the Chinese know it is energy actually gathered together to form form. So they're actually early quantum scientists, actually, in the paradigm. And the life science of consciousness has always been in China. Now, it goes through cycles too, just like any energy. And so the Chinese actually matured all its wisdom way before the Exo era. And in the Exo era, they start consolidating, like Lao Tzu and Confucius, into studies, into structure, into teaching. And by Han Dynasty, they are already consolidated all. From there is no more wisdom from China. It's only recycling into the cycle. So by Song and Ming and Song Dynasty, the cycles has already gone down, because the Tang Dynasty is an opening, very free to integrate on a global basis. So by Cultural Revolution, that's the last nail of the death of the form. And now China is repositioning. Unlike Mao, which is really try to unify China again under socialism, and Deng Xiaoping, which is really focusing on the effectiveness, the famous saying of black cat, white cat, the one who catch the mouse is a good cat. That development is the only, tangible reasoning, and to get China out of poverty. Now China is out of poverty, and Xi Jinping is a third worldview. And in this is no longer a development. His focus is cultural revitalization. He understands the quality of the people is the quality of the nation. And China never had a locational concept nation. And you can see all the problem with the Islamic and stuff like that. They're all about the Han culture as a foundation of the nation. And so therefore people are called not Chinese people, but Han people, because it's cultural specific. So the continuity always is deep into the thinking, despite of different regime and different concept that have been driving. And so while China is heavily affected by similar material worldview, this deep tradition that is existing in most of China, because it is mostly just farming state to 40 years ago, that it is still practiced a lot, and it's existing in this living culture, although it is not talked about in the political setting. Now today is different. This new direction of China, which declare for the destiny of humanity, which because we have sustainability, we should revitalize the worldview. And the worldview is a very traditional one. One is the one that always the highest one, which is the spiritual practice of become one inside us, so we can express the dual world of the material separation in the proper way, and back to the internal oneness, which is the real world, and starting from that place to express ourselves in the dualistic world. The second one is a harmonious work towards among nation. And the third one is a view of harmony and collaboration among diversity in society. And the third one is a morality towards goodness. And is already developing, calling people to believe this Chinese characteristic, which is of course the worldview. They're very important because that creates a culture. Chinese characteristic, socialistic market economy. And of course, the market economy, socialistic means the market economy serves the socialistic good, and therefore much more regulations needed away from making sure that personal goods, personal gain is not at a sacrifice, and that the personal market economy is really serving the good of the market. And they call on people to have confidence in this, confidence in the new direction, confidence in the traditional culture, and confidence in themselves. And this confidence in themselves in the Chinese comes very much in the Buddhist tradition, where it says, we are all knowing already. We are totally sufficient with wisdom. And from there, we come the natural state of confidence. It just comes because we know. And so therefore, it'd be interesting to see how politics unfold in real life as China developed this paradigm, a quantum paradigm, which directly relates to the Chinese paradigm almost directly, and now going to revitalize it. And then it is a next cycle. And again, the Chinese Buddhism and thing already talk about the coming of this new era, the next exo era, and therefore a lot more awakening is going to happen because the energy of Earth have shifted, the equinox have shifted, and human beings are going to awaken. And so in China, this particular thing is happening. And I think sooner than 8 years, which is the latest prediction by England, that China will be the biggest economy on Earth. And now more saying is that it will come faster after the virus. And so I think that the development in China would be a very interesting to watch, where they are now revitalizing the traditional culture in a modern context, and see how that will be a modern expression of this traditional continuity and the cycle of death and birth of the Chinese culture in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That brings up the question, are we hearing about an ideal, a prospective ideal, but looking at recent history with China and its own relationship to traditional cultures, the Tibetan, what can sometimes is described as actually a genocide, whatever else can be said about it, the savaging of Tibetan culture for decades, and now more recently, the clear suppression of the indigenous Muslim culture, the Uyghur culture, Islamic culture, raises the question as to, are we talking about a set of professed ideals being completely counter to actual practices, or am I missing something about that?
Absolutely. It's like the Western democracy. Can you call it democracy? It's a system, but we will talk about it, right? So,
right.
So there's a big difference between ideology and practice, but the evolution continues, and it is when the practice get corrupted gradually. So China, for example, wow, we're really polluting, really backwards, but they become the biggest spender in environmental protection, and the biggest spender in technological advancement. And the latest declaration is they said science and technology belong to humanity and not belong to anyone else. And so they are making progress as well. And I will see that in the 21st century, they need a new expression of harmonious coexistence. And this is part of the systemic change of expression of how they would do laws and things like that in the future. Now, Chinese are very good in using economic systemic change into workings as well. And so we shall see how it unfolds.
So this is really an interesting line here through Arthur to you, and I think on coming on to Ervin. The sociologist Peter Berger talked about, in order to have spiritual renewal in any culture, there need to be what he called plausibility structures, actual practices and discussions that circulate deeply in the culture that bring alive not only the ideals or ideas about oneness, but actual manifestations of it. If I get sick anywhere in the world, I know I can go to a local Chinese herbal shop, and very likely in the back of that store, there's going to be a little old man or little old woman who's going to look at my tongue, take my pulses, and give me a formula for a bunch of exotic herbs that I'm going to take home and boil down. And my experience has been it's some of the best medicine you can have on earth. And it's just one of many spectra of the manifestations of the Tao and of Chinese culture that have created this kind of great loom. And I know the same thing exists in Tibetan culture and elsewhere, in Indian culture, elsewhere in Asia. In Europe, that dimension of kind of the manifestations of the ultimate being stepped down or translated into health practices, political practices, marriage practices, cultural practices, didn't really survive. So the question I have for you two is, how are we going to strengthen these plausibility structures, move them into culture and all the practical areas that Nafiz Ahmed was identifying at the end of his talk? Food, agriculture, medicine, transportation, and so on, infusing the higher vision, the Tao, as you say, the spirit, we might say the Gnostic vision, into the media of ordinary life so that it allows our human family, our human community to be elevated in its vision, to see that this is a living psychophysical cosmos in practical terms, that there is a living energy, the chi, the Tao, that flows through all beings, that animates us, and that requires our participatory responsibility. It's not just a drug or a pill. It requires a growth process, and culture is then redefined, not as a consumerist event for passive people of accumulation, but a participatory process of, like you say, harmonization, mutual engagement, sacrifice, love, all those aspects of, again, the Tao. How do we bring this into life so that they infuse and uplift our culture, so that we do start to have this true parapolitics, this new paradigm?
Well, I'm actually writing my next book called Hindsight 2040, which talk about a vision, possible vision, and the trend that leads to that, and how it may happen in transition. But we all know, as you said earlier, we evolve against challenges or perceived challenges. And so therefore, without challenge, we have no evolution in this form, in the human form. And culture, the continuity, you have to take out what is the essence of the culture, right? Culture is how we live, and worldview create culture. We don't judge too much the form, and cultural continuity is its essence, not its form. And with technology, many forms change. Now, there's a trend in China that people wearing clothes from the Han Dynasty. It was totally impractical. It's long, it's dragging along the floor and all that. Well, that's not cultural continuity, And if you really understand, recently we had a work that is done. What is the Chinese concept of beauty, right? And so when you go down into the essence of it, the Chinese beauty is an expression of what actually the Greek tradition is. What is true is good and beautiful. And so the creation of beauty or design on everything in the state of being true, which is when you're not distorted by your desire and everything, then your state of meditation, your state of calmness and stillness, and in stillness, you will find your God. And there you'll find your wisdom in the Chinese tradition. There you create what you see in your inner self into the creation process. And so people share eternally. And so I think that the so-called continuity of what's good and what's bad, it's a dualistic mindset that we have to put aside when we examine some of these evolutionary issues, because those are just projections, right? Those are just our state of mind projection. It's dualistic in nature, it's judgmental in nature, And I think we will be definitely necessary to move. We will not get out of projection, but we will be aware that we're always projecting. And that is the law, basically. It's a holographic cosmos with different dimensional projecting, and we are still projecting. And our state of awareness decide how we project. That is actually the core of Chinese, both Taoist and the Buddhist tradition. So I hope that this explains some of my point.
You know, I think it does it really well, and I think this is a great a moment to introduce our third speaker. Again, our founder and president of the Laszlo Institute, Dr. Ervin Laszlo, and I really should say Doctors Ervin Laszlo, because I don't think we can count the number of honorary PhDs he's received, along with his other honors and awards, including the Japanese Peace Prize, the Assisi Mandir of Peace Prize in 2006, the fact that he was nominated in 2 years in a row for the Nobel Peace Prize, that he's written over 101 books, not to mention innumerable papers, but also been a member of numerous scientific and cultural bodies active at the UN, internationally, great American universities such as Princeton, and also a founder of the Club of Budapest, an organization looking to actually draw together these cultural strands that we're seeing in this conversation here. Ervin, picking up on this idea of plausibility structures, you've been going, I would say, to use the phrase hammer and tong, at one of the fundamental to our culture, the plausibility structure of modern science, or what we call science, and really working to upgrade our understanding of how actually science itself provides one of the most profound and powerful plausibility structures for this new paradigm of inherent unity, of our not only deep interconnectedness, but also the fact that we're not merely discrete, finite, separate beings, but we're existing all together in an active matrix that's a living, vibrant plenum. How do we translate that plenum, that new scientific view, into a cultural transformation that leads to a real restoration of a truly human, cooperative, and internationally networked, locally based politics?
Well, Bill, using science as our key to the better world is very optimistic. I think not everybody will always act on the basis of scientific insights, although it certainly helps. But there is something else, and I'd like to talk about something else. We talked about the mystical state. We talked about the tremendous challenge that is in front of us, and the prospects of actually meeting this challenge being rather dim. So here we are at a very decisive point. So this symposium, it seems to me, is something very essential. It's not just about a worldview. It's not just about a concept of politics. It's about whether we can stay on this planet. It's really in question. To how do we act in such a way that we can meet the challenge of becoming a positive part, a sustainable part of the tremendous wave of development which has started with the Big Bang and led to the biosphere and led to the forms of life wherever they might happen and occur in the universe. That's a tremendous question. It's a question, can we make it, will we make it? I would like to say, despite of the pessimism that I share in some respects with István Teplan, and I share fully the concept of Nafez Ahmed, of the tipping point that is awaiting us, an absolutely critical tipping point. I would like to say there is a chance that we can meet the challenge. We have an unsuspected help, actually two unsuspected helps. One is the global crisis, the virus crisis. It's a tremendous boost of our chances of surviving on this world. Seems strange, seems a paradox. I'll explain it in a moment. The other one is the our sense of cultural change, of cultural evolution. And something here that is prompts us, that is coming from science, not directly by scientists telling us that, but by the rationale that we get if you look at what scientists are telling us. And that's something which is, I think, is in us, is deep in us. But science is telling us, if you only look at the consequences of the story that we hear, and that's what is being told us, is that what emerges is that we don't live in a chaotic, chance-based, random universe. We live in a highly coherent universe, a coherence that is not likely to have come about by random interactions in the amount of time that was available, 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang. Not even the DNA of a fruit fly would have come about by chance interactions under any reasonable estimate of those interactions during this time. Einstein said that the most remarkable thing about this universe is that it's coherent, that we can understand it. It's so coherent that there's some aspects of it that we can understand, and that we ourselves exemplify. We are not here by chance. This universe is not here by chance, not through chance interactions. Serendipity doesn't answer. There is something which is in evolution, call it an evolutionary drive or an evolutionary impetus, or what I call it as an attractor in the universe, something which changes the statistics of chance. By chance, the kind of world that we have, food has no exit. We would go down with it. But chance is not the only thing that there is. There is something much deeper than that. I'd like to say a few words about what that is and why that is a chance, why that is our chance. The global crisis in which we still are, that has given us a tremendous option, an opportunity of rethinking the so-called business as usual, of trying to see if that's the only way that we can do. Is that human nature? Is that the laws of nature? Is that what the old Darwinist concept of the survival of the fittest, only the strongest survives? Is that the system for politics? Is the concept for politics? Is that kind of a rethinking which is coming about through the global crisis, through the virus crisis, which shows us, on the one hand, that we are all sitting in the same boat, we are all exposed to the same threats and also the same opportunities, and on the other, it shows us that there is more than pure chance underneath this universe. If we had to trust to chance, I think Ishan Tepla would be entirely right. We would have a chance of a snowball in hell to make it out of this tremendous bypass, out of this almost dead end kind of a development that business as usual is taking us into. But there is something more. We wouldn't be here, it was only chance. And I trust that something more is coming to the fore already. As we are challenging the status quo, as more and more people asking, is that what we want? Is there another way? And as more and more young people are coming on the scene that maintain that their sense of belonging to each other, the sense of oneness, which we have heard from Frederick Tsao also is present in the Tao, it's probably present in all the great cultures of the religions of the world. This sense that we are belonging together, that ultimately we are united in something which we can describe as a sense of oneness, a sense of belonging, and basically a sense of unconditional, all-encompassing love. Now, this seems very idealistic, but it seems to me that cultural change is happening, and cultural change is the only thing that can take us past this tipping point into a world that's sustainable, and that's capable of life and of development.
Let me ask the three of you a question about all this new paradigm. We can formulate, I think, this new paradigm in terms of principles, philosophies, practices, and so on. But at the core of what each of you are bringing is this idea really that it must come from a living tissue of reality in human life, in human practice. And certainly if you know anything about Taoism and the Chinese culture altogether, the highest regard is offered to the three immortals, to the adepts, the spiritual practitioners who become infused with the higher divine life. Certainly, this is true of indigenous cultures of all kind. Arthur, you've talked in your book about having a council of elders, wise women and men who can help guide those of us as we come along on our path to maturity. And I was thinking about this statement that D.H. Lawrence once said, that no man can know the divine until he sees it in the eyes of another human being. And I think each of us can speak of experiences of meeting extraordinary figures, spiritual figures, in whom there was a spontaneous connection and an enlivenment. Certainly that's true of every tradition I know of on earth. I was thinking about an apocryphal book said to be written by Plato, but probably not, in which there's a dialogue with a young man who comes to him and says, comes to Socrates and says, by the gods, Socrates, you're not going to believe this, but it's true. I've never learned anything from you, as you know, but I made progress whenever I was with you, even if I was only in the same house and not in the same room, but more when I was in the same room. And it seemed, to me at least, that when I was in the same room and looked at you when you were speaking, I made much more progress than when I looked away. And I made by far the most and greatest progress when I sat right beside you and physically held onto you or touched you. And then he complains, but now, having been away, all that condition has trickled away. How do we, at this most local, intimate human culture, begin to acknowledge and differentiate the communities, like you were saying, Arthur, value the communities, monastics, lay communities, whatever, who embody this transcendent influence, bring it into our cultural sciences? How do we make that transition in a democratic, egalitarian world, highly competitive, which is highly technocratically oriented? How do we bring this forward, this element of cultural renewal forward?
Well, that's a great and essential question. There's no doubt. And the paradox is that we're in a period of gigantism and of gigantic state and meta-state apparatuses. And so how does the immediate, the local, the living develop within that? And the answer is that I think it has to develop to at least a considerable extent organically and separately. So the seeds are present; they already exist. I mean, the things that I alluded to earlier in terms of these different traditions and practices do all exist, and people can engage in them. And so that takes place on a local and immediate level much more than on a grand level. But the question I would have is on a meta level, how, and this would be for Ervin, how would on a meta level the kind of localism that Mystical State and a number of my other books are focusing on, how could at a meta level that local renaissance be encouraged? That's my question.
That is the question. I fully agree, yes. I think we are on the tip of an evolutionary leap, and the alternative to that is truly dismal. Now, if you look at it purely statistically, the chances are very poor. If you look at it in view of what actually has been happening in this universe and even on Earth, on the sphere of life, and then a sphere of human life, then we see a different picture. What is happening is not something that would just one dancing after another. what is happening is something that originates deep down inside us. The key is not outside. The key is not above. The key is inside and below, in us. We have to reconnect. I've written a book a couple of months ago about reconnecting to the source. I am now writing a follow-up for that. It should be published next week, as a matter of fact, called Upshift, Meeting the Challenge. And my thesis is having this blessing of a crisis, moving us out of a rut, having them in front of us, the necessity of going deep down inside us to find something, the way forward, that there is a GPS, which is not a technical one, which is an instantaneous one. It's in our consciousness. Let's talk about, we haven't mentioned too much about consciousness, but our mind, our consciousness is something that is an agent, a shaping, formative agent. And that consciousness actually is beginning to reflect a different kind of a world, project a different kind of a world. Young people are the key element, at the forefront of this development. Those who create communities, who try to live in a different way, who reject this mechanistic, grandiose seeking of power on money and higher technology, always with this selfishness in mind. The new culture is what I've been saying, and I want to say again, just in a couple of words, is a holistic culture. The complex adaptive systems, as we've already been talking today, are not only adapting to the world, they're also adapting the world. Each system has in itself a capability to evolve, to adapt itself and to adapt the world around it. That is the capability we have to mobilize. The great mystical traditions, the great religions, great art, and now also great science, all tell us that we are not separate. This oneness that is coming to the fore is basically the one that could motivate action, motivates the transformation. We have to look for something else than the tried and tested methods. And this something else will be found inside us. I call it, using a term that Stan Grof has come forth, I call it the holotropic attractor, the holotropic impetus. Evolution is not possible, would not have been possible without such an attractor operating already at the level of quanta, and then of atoms and molecules and crystals and cells and on ecologies and species, of course. This would not be possible. So there is this. We have to mobilize it. We have to go down into this. Young people are doing it. It's expressed in song, it's expressed in dance, it's expressed in drama. The way that is moving forward is our hope. It's beyond the business as usual of just seeking money, seeking power. And it calls for an entirely different politics. Seeking that politics and joining in that politics could give rise to that small group, which you call a critical mass, the small group that Margaret Mead called changes the world. As she said, nothing else ever did. This is a hope to create locally, yes, I agree, locally, create the group cultures, the new cultures of the periphery that can move forward, because we are in a crisis. The outlook and the absence of this is bleak. Therefore, we have a chance. We have a chance to that very unlikely source to activate, which is the unlikely source, which is us, which is our deeper self, our deeper understanding, because that deeper self is one, has this oneness in it. Schrödinger said that, Einstein said that, Jung said that. I think all the great scientists and poets obviously also have been saying that. And that's the way forward. And now with the chance of a crisis, with the golden opportunity of a crisis, we can move in that direction. So let's move it. That, I think, is what we need to do. That is what I keep saying over and over again. We have a chance, and the chance is not in authority beyond us. The chance is in our own inner authority.
Thank you, Ervin. I want to encourage our live audience here to take real advantage of the appearance here of both Ervin and Arthur, and we're trying to bring Fred back. Just so you know, he's in Singapore, so he's really at the wee hours of the morning, quite late at night. Actually, about 2 or 3 in the morning, I believe. So we hope we can get him back. But we've set aside the final half hour of this session for your questions to engage our speakers on. I can't think of anything more critical in the issue. If we are talking about a truly spiritually infused new vision of culture, and they've both done extraordinary work to provide many of the aspects of the outlines of that. And I've noticed in both of you in your careers have sort of found the way to freely follow your particular interests and passions and engage with others in allied threads that don't fit within the academic boundaries. It's not often that an expert on Neoplatonism is talking as a Tibetan Buddhist and talking about soil and politics and so on. And likewise, Ervin is engaged from politics to medicine to just about everything else. I think that this generalist orientation is what we all are, really, and we all are responsible for our whole bodily being. But one of the most ancient metaphors for cultural life and growth is, in fact, that the human being is also patterned in a complete connection and identity with the cosmos. And that this intuitive connection with not only the earth, but also with the sky. In fact, I would say probably the most universal esoteric schema that you could probably say is identified from Druidic cultures, esoteric Christianity, Chinese mysticism, and Asian mysticism is something on the order of we're an earthly vital being, a manifest, meat body, a machine, and we're also a subtle being. That there's this higher intuitive gnosis that's a vehicle of a divine light, and that the divine energies that descend from above and these earth energies from below combine at the heart. And so it's kind of heaven, earth, and then as sometimes the word man will say humankind here, is where that is synthesized. I think that's what Jeff Kripal was telling us at the end of his talk about the greater human we're talking about. And no longer are the gods isolated elsewhere, but they are in fact manifestations of this greater reality. So these are great schemas of understanding that have been put into practice. I'm asking the audience here now, what are your interests and questions to engage with these speakers who speak from really depth of knowledge and experience of our principal cultures on Earth about this matter of cultural renewal as the basis of political renewal and where we take it into politics. So I invite you to send me those questions, and I will bring them to you. Fred, thank you for coming back.
Hi.
Please, a cup of coffee put it on the Laszlo Institute tab. We know you're up in the middle of the night there. So were you able to follow? We didn't see you for a while. Were you able to follow?
Yeah. Well, I was just, I turned it off for distraction, but I followed the conversation all along. I'm sitting here.
So what about this matter of heaven, earth, and that meeting point and the human heart? And the meeting, the human being being in a truly connected with the cosmos, not as a future evolutionary development, but as something that's already the case, in which the evolutionary development is that we start to wake up to that fact, right?
Yeah. So the Eastern tradition, the body has many layers, and the Indian says we have different layers. You have your physical body, then your emotional body, then your mental conscious body, and then you have your spiritual soul, or whatever we call it. And the Chinese are talking about the different level bodies and how life is created from heaven and earth and spirituality. And so these are body of knowledge that a little known to outside. So when you understand, there's a book called Yellow Emperor Canon. This is the book about understanding the human mind, body, spirit. Okay, it's actually, most people think of it as a Chinese medicine book, but actually talked about in there very clearly how we are created, the different bodies, the energy of the universe and the earth, they dance, and the yin and yang's created, and evolutionary energy they call God participate, or the Tao participate, And then our soul is created, and from the soul we create a material energy of interaction that created our mind, then it created da 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 da. And so we are not created because father and mother get together and given birth. That's not the Chinese birth of human being. And so as we go deep inside ourselves, which we already know in our DNA, and further down when we're in the quantum level, we are out of field. That means that in the essence of everything, of all materialism, and same as Tao, is the same as you go deep. Go without and go within is the same thing. Without and within, thus above, thus below. All these all-dimensional, three-dimensional concepts, this is a concept. In reality, it's the same thing. And so this unification is already united. All we need to do is awaken it. Now we talk a lot, and often we sometimes flip intellectually back and thought with the language of duality of material separating world, and sometimes talk about the oneness world using a duality language of understanding. And so it's actually, we're in the state of both. However, as we awaken, no language needs to be spoken. The lady who said to the person next door, they are energetically linked, they are energetically communicating, they're spiritually connected, and that's why they do. And this concept of the material energies, energy in exchange, is on the surface. You can go deeper. And so therefore, when she's close to the person, the energy is felt better. But even if you go deeper into a bigger energy net, she can be anywhere, because energy has no time and space. So it depends how her mind is developed and where consciousness is. And if you're conscious of that, once you're conscious, you're conscious. And your neural connector will start changing. That is expression of consciousness into our brain, our neural wiring, our personality, our thinking patterns, so forth, so forth, so forth. It's just another expression of the different bodies and different level of communication. Thank you.
Thank you. Arthur, you've written about this matter of esotericism, and you've actually surfaced some of it that I think has been largely unknown even to people very interested in Western religious and spiritual traditions, in the Christian theosophical tradition, where there's actually a considerable amount of the very same kind of multi-level understanding of the composite being. If we're talking about a successful democracy, and people being qualified to exercise the franchise of vote and decision, certainly we want to see all of us raised up to a level of competence and appreciation of the real matters that we have to deal with. How much of that does it relate? How much would we consider infusing our educational systems, not just leaving them out on the fridges? And I don't mean as a state-sanctioned mandate, but more locally generated and culturally generated and mandated. But how much do we need, how important is it that we actually bring alive this esoteric vision in order to awaken this higher parapolitical vision of our opportunities?
Well, that's really an interesting thing you're bringing up, Bill, because what you're referring to is the educational system in which we exist now. I'm a professor at a state university, and the educational system is geared in particular ways to produce and exists within really a fairly, I would say, materialistic and technological paradigm. And so the kind of thing you're alluding to is in what way could something like Christian theosophy, which is a master-disciple kind of relationship, or spiritual teacher, spiritual student, that's at the center of that particular tradition, which is a tradition of Christian mysticism that starts about around 1600, and continues in France, in Germany, in England, then in America. Now, that is completely different paradigm. It's essentially totally unrelated to the educational system in which most of us, I myself, exist. And so that leads to a larger question, which is, how do you start to create something new? And that's something I'm actually engaged in. That's something that I'm extremely interested in. I created a nonprofit some years ago with a couple of friends of mine called Hyros. And Hyros, which means sacred in Greek, is about that. So how do we create a new educational frame, kind of frame and paradigm is part of what I'm engaged in. But the other thing I would mention, and this is coming back to what Ervin said earlier, there's another way. One way to think about our immediate future is that there is a meta shift, which is encouraged at a larger level. Another way to think about it is that we actually have a collapse of some kind, that it's not possible for these gigantic structures to be reformed. And so what we're doing when we create when we're talking right now, what we're doing is creating seeds for the future. In other words, there's another way of thinking about it as well, which is that ultimately these gigantic structures can't continue the way that they are. And so what we're doing is putting in place elements for the future to create a much more holistic, much more decentralized way of being. And that ties to education because education is central. That's the means for that transformative path that I was alluding to earlier. So those are just a couple remarks that I wanted to make. And hopefully, since I'm trying to keep it very brief, it makes sense.
Right.
Arthur, I'd like to just pick up on one thing that you said. It's the word that you said, a concept that I think is absolutely central to the whole idea of politics. And that you mean holistic. Because the world as we know, is as it's really created, as it really operates, is not by parts just exchanging superficial among themselves, randomly among themselves. There is something that creates systems, adaptive systems, adapting systems, creative systems, dissipative structures in Prigozhin's term, and something which ensures that what truly survives is not the strongest, but the most cooperative, the one that is most joined, most able to join with others together, creating whole systems. Politics needs to be operating on the basis of this ambition, this aspiration. The largest system that is relevant to us is the system of life. There's a system of Earth, yes, but there's also the ecological system. But for us together, what creates as a background is the web of life, is the system of which we are a part. Now, what is good for the system is good for humanity, is good for all members of humanity, because we can't live without it. That is the norm. That is the basis. Politics operating on the contrary principles, has been operating on the contrary principles. Just take the part, and at best the whole will take care of itself, because the market sooner or later will spread out the benefits, the invisible hand, if you at all call it for something, but actually ignore the rest. Just redo your own interests, your own constituency. Only make sure that you come first and nothing else. Hopefully that politics in the US has been serious. The question maybe it's now no longer dominant, but all over the world that Istvan Teplan was talking about, these dictatorships operating on the basis, my force, my nation, me, and my power, that is what counts. And that is the aim of politics. That is a totally dead-end politics. That is totally what creates us, brings us from a crisis into catastrophe. So the new idea is operate in such a way that what you do serves the entire system in which you operate. That you ask yourself always this question, is that survivable? Is that viable? Is that thrivable, what I'm doing? And the answer can be, must refer to the system in which we live, the system of life in which humanity is embedded. And we are embedded in humanity. The nation state is not something separate. It's just one level of organization and a highly overblown level, which are overemphasized. It's time to come back to the norm that we are operating in a system which has wholeness, which has oneness, which is based on this mutual attraction, which can be expressed by the sentiment of unconditional love. If that is the basis, idealistic, yes, I admit idealistic, but there is no other choice. There is no other way. That has to be the motivation for the small groups that are forming, and that's when they join together, can change the world and will change the world. This change will not come from the center of power. It comes from the periphery, and the center has been weakened. The periphery can empower itself. That is our chance. That is the golden opportunity brought to us by the crisis in which we live.
So I have a question here for the entire panel, which is that you have been talking about a new paradigm. And on the third day of this symposium, we're all going to gather together to draft a constitution of principles that we can all share in common. Knowing that we want our culture to be locally based, is there value to creating a universal understanding that we all share by perhaps drafting a constitution? And if so, what role would that play in this process of either preventing a great collapse or actually helping us come out of one?
Can you rephrase that question?
I think the question is the exercise that this symposium plans to do, it's kind of ramping up onto day 3, looking at the different kinds of emergent possibilities for cooperation, self-governance, using networks, revivification of our democracy around this much more intimate local processes that we're going to actually experiment with together. Concluding on day 3, in which everybody here is invited to actually join together in a 2-hour sessions to write, put down on paper, and share and decide what are the universal principles for an Earth Charter, an Earth Constitution that would serve this process of harmonization and restoration of our Earth.
Well, I'm not really the right one. Ervin is much better, I'm sure, at answering this than I am. I would only urge, because it's one of the main themes in my work, decentralization rather than centralization, because when you have vast centralized power, that's when you end up with vast kinds of destruction. And one of the things that came up that I mentioned earlier was contemporary China vis-a-vis Tibet. And a decentralized Tibet is entirely feasible. And there you would have, instead of the current policy, which is to stamp out the Tibetan language in Tibet and enforce Han Chinese on the children, you would have a decentralized place for Tibetans to flourish as Tibetans. And that is essentially what I'm talking about. So I think that's a critical, if I was going to say one thing, that's a critical element, it would be decentralization and as a means of flourishing. Regionalism and localism are I think, vital. So that would be my response.
So Arthur, if we're not talking about administrative structures of governance and control, but really about underlying principles that can unite us across these disparities, back in the 1960s, in the Haight-Ashbury, the flourishing of the hippie time, there was a group called the Diggers. They went onto Haight Street and they put up a wooden frame over the sidewalk. And they wrote at the top, frame of reference. And everybody walking by was invited to walk through the frame of reference so that we could all share the same frame of reference. That's my question, is can we, Earth beings of all kinds, find a common frame of reference and agree upon one that actually doesn't lock people up into anybody's control or administrative structures, governance structures, political structures, but finds a commonality that releases the underlying virtues and the higher energies that we've been describing coming from all the different cultures here.
Bill, I would say not only the question is can. There is no alternative to it. In a way, we must. If we are to survive, we must. Because we have disconnected the world in such a way that it orients only toward the small independent entities. This decentralizing doesn't mean disconnecting. Connected multiplicity, yes, connected local initiatives, but overall a coherence. We must agree on the basic possibilities, which means coherent development motivated from the ground up, locally, yes. That's also something we can agree on. It's not a contradiction. It's not that we are disagreeing the localness. We are agreeing it has to come from the ground up, grow organically, because we are human beings. We are living beings, and there is something that we share, something in common, that drive toward life, toward thriving, toward creating systems, coherence. That is something that we share. We must bring it to the fore, not to damp down our multiplicity or diversity, but to make it flourish. We find the unity in the diversity. It's an old slogan, but what we really need it. And I think our effort, our attempt to create an Earth Constitution means that we find the common element, the frame of reference, the context. We are truly living beings. First, that's what we are. Then we are human beings. Then we are Americans or German or Russian or Chinese, whatever. And then finally, we are family people and individuals. Yes, we are all of that. But we are also, on the highest level, we are living beings. And that's what unites us. Rediscover our viability, rediscover our thrivability, which means life comes first.
Thank you, Ervin. Fred, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that I was just thinking as I was listening on systems and stuff. I think that, again, if you, one way you can think about it is that our body is a 50 trillion cell system, right? Is it centralized or is it decentralized? It's both centralized and decentralized. It's about coherence. So when we think about centralized is good, decentralized not good, what happened is constant is moving around in this whole constant awareness and connection. We cannot think about centralized or decentralized, which is better. They all happen simultaneously and constantly. And this coherence is, which Ervin's mentioned, is very important. And, you know, just like Bruce Lipton talked about biology of beliefs, we start believing this is good or bad and judgmental, this is better, that's not, what just changes the system, right? Because it is consciousness. And we're tapping on our genes differently, depending on what our belief system is, which is information flow and how we're going to use resources from the genes for the cells to respond. So first of all, we have to think about system differently. The second thing is not local and global. Global and locals are integrated, but the local must be in the global context. Otherwise, the system is in reverse. You cannot have the global in the local context. And anyway, with technology and stuff, it's different. So today, the challenge is not just sustainability, it's also globalization and technology, but they're actually an opportunity too, because every challenge is an opportunity for evolution. Now, the Chinese have a very good system. They're now revitalists. And the Chinese have a book called The Great Learning, where technically, when you become an adult, it's also called the university, The Great Learning. And when you're 15, you go learn the book. And this book is about how do you do and understand a relational ethics system of human operations. And the whole purpose is to achieve goodness. And goodness is actually wholeness. And so that book is worth looking at, how the whole system can work. And again, we have to understand with a new paradigm of well-being, which is the whole system has to be well until we're well, that everything is life and life is everything. And then what is success in life and the life journey? The one today is material, is written for the material world, and people subscribe to the story, and we work with story. This is our life journey. We get up, we do this, and then finally go to university, and then we up there, and then maybe I get a PhD, and I get a really good job, and I get married, and the kids, and blah, 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 blah. And then there's a life story. That's a life journey. And success is if I have to tick up the box. And then now people, after they become wealthy, they look at it, well, I'm not happy, but I want to be happy. And then so when they pass survival, which is one level of living, to indulgence, which we have done, which is living for the sake of living, people start looking at, well, you know, there's more than living. We have to live for life. And so this is part of evolution as well. And so the system that we want to use, the system that understand how consciousness express into material expression, how the success story, what is a well-being, the systemic thinking has to go bigger. And this, you know, it cannot work when a small system is dictating the big system. They are not equal. They are not equal. We are within the system in holism. And so if you reverse the order, it doesn't work. So individualistic collectivism doesn't work because it's separation. And the paradigm is unity, it's oneness. And so we have to get out of the way we think about system, the success story of life, what is well-being, which the quantum paradigm actually sets the scene to finding the existential question. In fact, it already has the existential question. So I just want to say, yes, education is very important, paradigm change, connective, but we really need to first use the paradigm and re-examine our current projection, which is our state of consciousness.
So Arthur, is that contradictory to your view, or is it complementary?
What I would say is, you know, Fred's last remark about consciousness is critical. I think having a transformative path is part of what Ervin was referring to earlier when he said the answer is not external, it's internal. And it's looking within. And once you're looking within, you need an actual path, a way of transformation. And I think that's an extremely important dimension that all of us have shared in conversation here. And that also is a way of defining, in the questions, I saw the word parapolitics came up. And what does that mean? And I think one way of thinking about the term parapolitics is to think about politics in a very different way of understanding. That's what I'm aiming for in emphasizing some of the things that I've been emphasizing. There are different ways of seeing what does it mean to be one? One is an enforced oneness, which is externally imposed, which is sort of like the oneness of the Borg. The other is oneness that's experienced in an inward way. Those are completely opposite things. They're not identical. And so it's not that we're in opposition in what we're saying. It's that we need to tease out some of the differences between these concepts. And those are just a few brief remarks. But I think I would like to hear what Ervin has to say about some of these observations and some of the questions that have come up.
I'd love to hear also more questions, but we have two more days where we can look at the questions and continue the dialogue. Let me just say that in the book that we are just going to publish in 2 months' time, actually, with Fred Tsao, it's called The Dawn of a New Era of Well-Being. What we are doing precisely what we have been talking about, approaching various, or rather exploring various approaches to a better world. How can we create a better world? Traditional or modern approaches, Eastern or Western, scientific or secular. We are looking at various approaches. The thing is that there are many ways leading to that. what it's leading to is a sense of unity, which is not a sense of monolithic oneness, monolithic sameness. That's external oneness, what Arthur talks, or external oneness, what Fred is talking about also. It's not the external. The internal oneness is the only oneness. I cannot call the external an external oneness truly oneness. That's uniformity. That's imposing the regime of a military or of a sect on the members. The true oneness comes from understanding that we are part of a diverse but coherent system, a truly adaptive evolutionary system. That sense, there is no substitute for that. That if we feel that, if we sense that, we'll start acting differently. And that, I hope, is contagious. Not only virus is contagious, this sense of oneness, it could be contagious. I think it's expressed in song and expressed in so many different ways now. It's expressed in the sciences, yes, in the new biology, in the new cosmology, in the new quantum physics, obviously, as Fred is talking about, the quantum paradigm. It comes through, but it comes through in art as well, in spirituality as well, I think, as Arthur would know best. It comes through in all levels. That is the way forward. If we can further that, then we are doing good politics. If you're ignoring it, then we are doing mistaken politics. Nothing else is as primary, as important, as furthering our sense of belonging together. Not sameness, but diversity, but individuality, but coherent, connected. That's how the world operates. It operates as a coherent wholeness. And we either part of it or we'll say, or we leave the stage of history. I hope not, but we have to become part of this great evolution of wholeness in the world, of convolution of coherence. That is my hope.
I can't think of a better note to end this session on. I want to thank our three panelists, Ervin Laszlo, Arthur Versluis, and Fred Tsao. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you everybody for staying on. I want to just take a moment before I let you go to break to preview our next session. We're going to be moving out of this kind of more generalized view, both kind of historical and also philosophical, religious overview, and getting very practical in the next round. Our next moderator, who I will introduce on the hour, Gary Jacobs, has a distinguished background in the World Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's assembled an extraordinary panel of people who he will introduce, who have been active at everything from the local level to the international political level at the UN and security, looking at now how their actual concrete experience of bringing this higher paradigm of unity to bear on very specific practical issues. So this is a time where the rubber meets the road for the first time, and where we are in a existential crisis. That word existential crisis means that our existence is in doubt. Our survival is in doubt. There's no doubt about that if you've been participating this morning. And at the same time, there are more than a few shoots. There is, in fact, a global upsurge that has been described as a blessed unrest by Paul Hawkins, of literally tens of millions of people activating in all kinds of ways to change the paradigm totally. Well, we're going to see some frontline people who've been doing that. I'll tell you what it takes and what it ends. So we will see you now. This is our break. We'll see you exactly in half an hour, and begin squarely on the hour with Gary Jacobs and our next discussion. So that'll be the final one of the day, just yet another 90 minutes. Thank you all for persisting to date. Look forward to seeing you then.